What's up, guys? Alexander here with datepsychology.com. So today we're going to do a review of Blackpill science. So what is that, guys? What is Blackpill science? Many of you will have heard of the black pill. Some of you will not have heard of the black pill. But this is the belief, the set of beliefs, or the ideology that physical attractiveness is the most important thing in dating, and more specifically, that facial attractiveness is the most important thing in dating. Some people may dispute that definition. That's kind of what we are working with. So what I'm going to do today, a little bit different. I went to Reddit's Blackpill Science subreddit, and I've looked at the most recent posts, just going right down the list. So not going through and picking out anything that I thought was good or bad, just kind of seeing what was posted, because I don't have an account on there. I don't even browse it that much these days. Usually I'm on Twitter now. So looking at these studies that they post, do they support the black pill? I'm not going to try to debunk anything or argue for the black pill or against the black pill or anything like that. So not a debunking video. We're not going to go through and nitpick the studies either. That's something I don't like to do. I think it's a pretty weak form of critique, although I know it's very popular that people like to go through and pick things out of the methodology or limitations and say, I don't believe it because of X, Y, and Z. But all of these studies, if they support the black pill or not, they're using pretty similar methodology, guys. So it is what it is. So I went down the list, looked at these studies. We'll go through them and see what shows up. So, showing here first the title that the individuals on the subreddit gave it, and then the title of the article. So this is a study here by Speed and Gangstead from 1997. Gangstead, of course, one of the big names in evolutionary psychology. It says, at an American university, a man's physical attractiveness significantly predicted his romantic popularity. And these other things did not. So, read these studies, we'll see. Does it say in the study what the people said that it says? What do the effects look like? What are the size of the effects? Very, very important. And I'll give it a rating, guys. I'll tell you if I think that it supports the black pill. How blackpilling is it really? So, did a man's physical attractiveness predict his romantic popularity? Yes. The way they measure that in this paper is they ask the peers of the man. They say, how popular is this guy with the girls? Or how popular is this woman? Because it's women in this study also. How popular is this woman with men? How is her romantic or his romantic popularity? So whatever. Is that good methodology or not? You decide for yourself. So is the title correct on that point? Yes. Was this the only variable that predicted romantic popularity? In this case, no. So what we see here in this chart, for example, is a list of variables. If you want to go through, these show you the size of the effect, and they show you if it was significant or not, statistically significant, right? Because statistical significance, remember, is not a measure of the size of an effect. It doesn't tell you anything except that, if you were to run it X amount of times, you would get a result this way beyond chance. So, what do we see here? Well, we see that being best dressed predicted romantic popularity about as well as being physically attractive. So, and other variables as well, right? The best trendsetters and that sort of a thing, right? The most self-confident, the most independent, and all of that. Here we see, again, what the authors say here, that men who were nominated, being particularly popular romantically, also tended to be nominated as being outgoing, self-confident individuals. So we're seeing a personality variable here, or a behavioral variable, right, that predicts romantic popularity. Being outgoing, being confident. And certainly this is the kind of advice that would be contrary to the black pill, right? The black pill being that looks only matter, and if you say, just be confident, bro, that's something that you would get called blue pilled, right? For people that aren't familiar with this terminology and in these ideological communities, right? That's some blue pill. There are people that say physical attractiveness doesn't mean anything at all, more or less, right? Just be confident, bro. So, but that's what this shows, right? That confidence predicted it. So this was posted on the Blackpill subreddit. What can be said? In this slide, however, still, physical attractiveness, it was still the top predictor. Not by a lot. And that's why you have to look at the effect sizes. You can't just say this is the top and then this is not. Because it could be a very big difference or it could be a very, very small difference. And when you have many variables, if you have something that's a top predictor and then you have 10 other things that are also good predictors, right? Then your top predictor is only explaining like 5% of the variance. You know, it's kind of like, what does it even mean to be the most important variable in that case? And that's something I'm going to make a video about and write about for you guys soon. Because on the one hand, you know, I think it's consistent across the research that being physically attractive or that physical attractiveness very often emerges as one of the top variables in romantic success, depending on how you measure it. If it's something like frequency of sexual activity in the last year, or if it's something, and even that's not entirely large, but if it's something like who gets picked to go on a first date, in speed dating studies, pretty consistently, you'll see physical attractiveness emerge as the most important variable. But then you go to look at the effect sizes and it's like, oh, but you have all these other variables that predict it a little bit less well. And you really get a picture where it's like, okay, so it's really a combination of like physical attractiveness and behavior and grooming and a bunch of other things. So, well, let's go on and see. Does this support the black pill? I'm going to give this one a 6 out of 10, right? Why? Physical attractiveness, the top predictor. Okay, so consistent with the black pill in this case. But it still did not predict this romantic popularity as estimated by peers better than a lot of these other behavioral variables, including ones that many black pillars would consider quite trite, right? Like bathe, bro, use soap and dress well and be confident. Well, you know, they predicted it in this case. Let's go on now to the next study. This is by Schaefer and colleagues, 2018. The title given on the Blackpill subreddit: significantly higher rates of physical dating violence victimization were reported among boys compared to girls. And the title of the actual article below, 10-year trends in physical dating violence. So this is not a paper, going on to the next slide, not a paper that is related to the black pill as in a dating context, right? We're not talking about anything related to attractiveness and all of that. But like I said, I just went down the list and some of these papers are not closely related to that theme. But what do we see anyway? Did boys experience higher rates of relationship violence? Yes. Reported correctly in the title. Was this, and you know, they say this is a statistically significant or a significant difference. What does that mean? As I've talked about in the past, statistical significance is not a measure of effect, right? It's not a measure of effect size, I should say. And so we ask next, was this difference clinically significant, which means does it matter? Is it large enough to mean something? And is it? Well, IPV, or interpartner violence or domestic violence, violence in relationships, has decreased for boys in this study from 8% to 8.5%, but it hasn't decreased for girls, at least not a statistically significant amount. It has decreased a little bit, but not enough that they could say that that is beyond chance. What's the difference between boys and girls in experiencing it, according to this paper? It's a 1.6% difference. So the rates of experiencing domestic violence for adolescents, for boys and for girls in relationships, apparently it's pretty rare, and the difference is not large. So would we say that this is significant clinically? That's a subjective question. So that's up to you to decide. Across a population, a small effect or something that seems small, you know, relative to 100%, 1.6%, might not seem like a big deal. If you said, well, how much does that contribute to like legal costs, like people getting arrested, going to the hospital because they get beat up by their boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever the case may be, you know, you might say this amounts to like millions of dollars costing the system. And you could say, okay, so even small effect is clinically significant. Certainly on an individual level, anyone that experiences domestic violence, it's significant to them. But do we really see a large difference between boys and girls? Not really. So, does this support the black pill? What is my rating on this? I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10. Why? It's not related to attractiveness. It's just something that they posted up there. And it's decreased for boys also. So we're not really seeing kind of the trend that we see in the black pill, right? Where things are getting worse, right? Kind of the doomer mindset, like, oh, things are getting progressively worse. You know, you could say this is a white pilling paper in a sense because it's decreased, right? And it's statistically significant, but maybe not clinically significant. You can debate that. I'm not going to tell you if it's a meaningful difference between boys and girls or not. Next slide, next paper. Fugeri and colleagues, 2017. Here we have one that is called, or the title the individuals on the subreddit gave it, Mothers Will Choose a Man Who Is Only Reasonably Attractive for Their Daughters. Daughters, on the other hand, prefer an attractive man, no matter how respectful, friendly, or intelligent he may be. And the title of the actual paper, The Importance of Physical Attractiveness. So this author, Madeleine Fugeri, if I'm saying her last name correctly, has a bunch of really good papers, very, very similar to this one. And if you look her up on her Google Scholar profile or ResearchGate or whatever, if you like papers like this, I think even this is kind of like or I should say there have been papers after this that are kind of like replications, very similar, and ones before this. So this is a finding that's pretty consistent. And this relates to something I've talked about in the past. Let's go on and do our fact check, right? I'm not really trying to like fact check anything or debunk these. So, do women prefer the attractive men? Yes. Did attractiveness matter more than the other traits? Yes. I put yes on here. We can get into that. Did it matter more to the daughters? Yes. So far, you know, we're seeing a good record with reporting the results in the titles. Whoever is uploading these to the subreddit is doing a pretty good job. But what do the results say here? This is a paper that supports what's called within the black pill, and within the red pill and manosphere, and the looks test, right? Which is that you must meet a certain minimum threshold of attractiveness for other traits to come into play, right? So if you are a good person or whatever the case may be, maybe that doesn't matter a lot or enough to get you a date or to get you into a relationship or have sex or whatever the case may be, unless you have that minimum threshold of attractiveness. This is something I've called in the past attractiveness as a gate, that attractiveness works as a gate. And this raises a question right off the bat. How high is that gate, right? How narrow is that gate, or how high is the bar that you must go over? Do you have to be really attractive to get a chance, or is it kind of low? But I think this is one of the things that the black pill has gotten right, and that's pretty consistent with the literature, right, is that looks function as a gate, that you do have to have a kind of minimum amount of attractiveness. Why is that? Why might that be? Well, no one knows what your personality is like when they first meet you, right? We don't have to discard personality as having a role in romantic relationship formation, because initially, when someone sits down in front of you, when they see you on the street, when you're going to work or a class or whatever the case may be, and you've never met someone, that's all they see, your appearance, right? And so you have your face, right? You have your full head of hair, you have, you know, the clothes that you wear, do you smell good? But these are all physical things. Some can be modified more than others, right? So attractiveness, boom, it sets a limit right off the bat. And I think that's consistent. I think that's something that the black pill has caught on to. It's not something that they invented or discovered necessarily, but but it is something that they are not entirely wrong about. So, you know, like I said, I'm not trying to go through and debunk anything, just kind of going over these papers. And yes, daughters preferred attractive men more. The other traits were more important for the mothers, but, you know, both still preferred attractive men. Let's look into this a little bit more, this paper, and what does it say? So in this paper, the methodology, they paired pictures of men rated for different, levels of attractiveness by participants ahead of time with vignettes or profiles that described them in different ways. So you had one that was like intelligent, it has described the dude as intelligent. One is like a combination of intelligent and respectful, combination of intelligent and kind, different vignettes that they used. All of these are positive. Okay, they didn't use any negative vignettes in this. So one thing that we can't know from this study is that if attractiveness can cancel out a negative personality profile, right? When we're comparing, is attractiveness more important than another personality trait we're still comparing across all of these groups individuals that had good personalities, which is something to consider. And even when they're comparing like, oh, is attractiveness more important than intelligence? They would be looking at someone who is attractive but also respectful and kind versus someone who is less attractive but just intelligent and without those. So kind of built into this, there's kind of a confound that I think might not be consistent with what a lot of black pillars may have interpreted this to mean. The idea that saying attractiveness is more important than intelligence, for example, which I don't think is a stretch. Certainly there's good research, recent research as well, that indicates that with good designs, I'll make a video on that at some point as well, that on a first date, for example, that intelligence, IQ, measured by IQ, might not play a large role. Other traits, probably a larger role, other behaviors. In any case, we don't know for sure that it cancels out an attractive profile, but what else do we know here? Okay, so remember at the beginning I said we have to look at effects, right? We have to look at the difference between these groups. It's not sufficient just to say one was more. Even if we know that it is a statistically significant difference. Why? Because a difference can be statistically significant and so small that it's meaningless. Very common, right? Many such cases. So, was there little difference? Yes. Small difference, okay? The mean rating of men in the moderately attractive, and this is like their score, right? The would you date them, right? By the attractive and moderately attractive category was 3.9 versus 3.90. So this is statistically significant here. At the same time, it's not a large difference. You have an effect size reported in the little cutout here that is an eta squared of 0.05. If you looked at that like Cohen's d or something, it would be like 10. So conventionally considered a very, very small effect. So this wasn't the case if you looked at the least attractive profiles. They get a little bit more of a hit, but what does this indicate? That the looks test is low, right? The bar is kind of low. It's not so high that only the most attractive men really high in attractiveness, pass it before the other traits are considered, right? Before respectfulness, kindness, or whatever else they included in this, right? You pass the test, bar's kind of low, and then all those other things get considered on top of it. So is that consistent with the black pill? Probably not how a lot of guys are interpreting it. Same here for the halo effect on personality, right? They asked, for ratings of desirability of personality. How does attractiveness influence that? Because one thing that is very consistent across the research for, the last 50 years is the halo effect. And the halo effect is what? When you pair an attractive individual with traits, or when you ask someone about traits associated with an attractive individual, they rate the individual higher in those positive traits, right? So, attractive face, ask, is this person extroverted? Is this a good person? Compared with an unattractive face, it's going to get a higher rating most of the time. But what we see here is a pretty small effect on that as well. So, something else to consider. And in the chart below, we have the mean ratings across all of the conditions. Each condition, right, is faces different levels of attractiveness paired with the different vignettes describing the personality in different ways. Attractive, moderately attractive, unattractive. Look at those bars, take a minute. You can see, where the error bars don't overlap, statistically significant, but at the same time, you can see that the differences between moderately attractive and attractive men, pretty small. When you look at the unattractive men, it's a little bit bigger, right? The white line in that graph, boom, it's much lower. So unfortunately, the unattractive men take a big hit, but by the time you hit that moderately attractive level, you're competing. You're in the game, so to speak. So, does this support the black pill? Okay, well, this is a paper that shows a clear relationship between attractiveness and selection. The bar was pretty low, but for the least attractive men, the effect was larger when compared with them, right? They did get a hit. So pretty black pilling, in a way it is, in a way it's not, because it's certainly not the idea, right? The support for the idea that only like the top 10% of men can ever attract a woman. But at the same time, it's not looking good for, the bottom 30% of men we'll give it a 7 out of 10 as far as blackpillingness. Here's another one. I just went down the list. Harvard Crimson survey. I've reported that because this was a survey taken for the Harvard Crimson, which is the university magazine or newspaper of Harvard University. And the title here says, among Harvard freshmen, 62.4% of non-athletes reported being virgins compared to 38.7% of athletes. Okay, and it didn't even really have much of a title. It said, meet the class of 2025. So it's a recent survey. That's what it says. I was reading the comments and someone said, this is garbage, it's not peer reviewed. I'm surprised that anyone in the Blackpill community subreddit really cares if something is peer reviewed. Certainly people that aren't academics seem to care about peer review more than academics do. If you guys knew how many academics just hate the peer review system and would love to just get rid of it entirely and just be able to publish their things and have people critique it afterwards. But people seem to think it's important for some reason. I'll tell you one thing with peer review, they're not checking anyone's data, guys. If people are faking data or whatever, it's just getting right through. They're looking and they're editing stuff, but not usually anyway. Anyway, moving on. Is the claim true? Yeah, it's exactly what is reported. This is what I see in the headlines for the people posting this on the Blackpill subreddit. They're not misunderstanding these studies generally. They're typically getting it right. They're not just making stuff up. So is the claim true? Yes. Okay. Is this consistent with other literature? That's something we can ask if anyone worried about peer review. Yes, and this is something I've written about in my most recent article on the website as well. Just one example from past research, Buer and Howarth, 2012. This showed the effect of sport participation on ratings of physical attractiveness. So what does that mean? They took pictures, identical pictures, same guys, and they broke it into conditions, right, with a vignette. The vignette describes someone as someone who doesn't play sports, a man who doesn't play sports, I should say, a man who plays sports recreationally, a man who plays sports competitively. And you see the effect that competitive sports, boom, you're associated with that, you get rated higher in facial attractiveness. Non-competitive sport, boom, you're still high, but a little bit lower. And then the non-sport players, right, boom, they're down at the bottom. So just being associated with sports, right, just like I play sports, makes women rate your face more attractively. Is that blackpilling? Probably the opposite of blackpilling, right? Because it shows that there's a behavior that you can do that, because the halo effect is bidirectional, right? People with good personality traits or different, I should say, some are good, some are bad. Certainly there's research on the dark triad, for example, but certain personality traits, when a face is paired with them in vignettes, raise perceptions of attractiveness, and at the same time, attractiveness raises perceptions of good personality traits. And this can even be seen in neuroscience research and scans on the brain that there is similar activation in the brain for judgments of moral goodness and judgments of physical attractiveness. These are processed in the same part of the brain. So, bidirectional. That's an important point. What does that mean? Let's look at this slide. Is it blackpilling and what does it mean? Well, it's not facial attractiveness, right? We're looking at a behavior, which is sport participation. You are a student athlete at Harvard. What might be going on that makes you more attractive or more likely to have sex? Well, these could be individuals that have a personality disposition that make them more likely to take risks, right? Because being promiscuous is a sexual risk behavior. We talk about it like it's a good thing, and I say we, but I'm just talking about men in dating and men in the black pill or whatever. They talk about it like they want to have a lot of sexual partners, but it's a sexual risk behavior, and it's associated with risk-taking personality and behavior very, very consistently. So people that join the football team or something, they might be higher in that. They might be higher in extroversion. They might have a larger friend group, a social group, right? Then at the same time, they might also be higher in status, right? And they might have a better physique. So they might also be more dominant, because dominance also predicts having more sexual partners independently of physical attractiveness or facial attractiveness. So some of these things are things that you can arguably change, at least somewhat. Certainly, I'm kind of black-pilled myself on the extent to which personality changes can be made, but some of these are more malleable nonetheless than, say, increasing your height, right? So we're going to say you can change some of these. You can change some of your behavior, your personality. You can change your physique, I think, even more than personality. If you want to know my opinion on that, people can get jacked, you know, even most people can get kind of jacked and have a nice physique that will put them ahead of most other men. Probably that's even more malleable than personality. It's one of the reasons that I recommend, you know, in the very little bit of dating advice I ever give is just like try to get jacked, right? Try to get a great body, whatever. So is this blackpilling? Not really. I wrote down 5 out of 10. Maybe I would say it's lower now that I'm reading the slide, but whatever. Not especially blackpilling to me that a set of behaviors measured by sport participation results in more partners. Has nothing to do with facial attractiveness, no measure of physical attractiveness in this case. We're probably looking more at behavioral attractiveness. And if it is physical attractiveness related to something that you might be able to change a little bit, like your physique. So, next slide. What are we looking at here? Adams and colleagues from 2018, the title given to this on the subreddit. Are CEOs born leaders? Lessons from traits of a million individuals. The median large company CEO belongs to the top 17% of the population in cognitive ability and to the top 5% in a combination of cognitive and non-cognitive and height. Ooh, a mouthful. Are CEOs born leaders? Lessons from traits of a million individuals. This is kind of a neat study because it looked at a large population sample from the Swedish military. So they had all of these measures of cognition, cognitive and non-cognitive behavioral traits, as well as height, physical measurements and stuff like that. Is the claim true? Yeah, it's true. You know, like I said, then, you know, I don't think whoever's uploading these things is just like making stuff up, you know. So what do we see? Non-cognitive ability, which will be essentially personality traits, best predictor of being a CEO. Cognitive ability a little bit higher, and then height also. So certainly something like height is something that you would not expect to predict being a CEO, right? Like, why would someone who is taller be better in a meritocratic sense, right? Be better at being a CEO. And so certainly this shows an effect of physical appearance, height, one that you can't change very much, on a life outcome, you know, being higher in the social dominance hierarchy, as it is sometimes called. And that doesn't seem very fair, does it? You know, why are you excluded from that if you're short? But, well, this is something, you know, not just in this paper, that has been pretty consistent over the research as well. In economics, they've looked at, you know, CEOs are taller on average. You know, taller men, you know, they're probably higher in status most of their life, starting at a younger age. Because of that, because of physical dominance, maybe they become more behaviorally dominant because they are able to, right? Because they get pushed around less or whatever, you know, speaking loosely, and that sort of a thing. So how blackpilling is that? Let's look and see. Well, it's not a paper that has anything to do with dating or attractiveness. Okay, so I took points off for that because, you know, that's what the black pill is, right? We're talking about that. Specifically, I mean, this can be blackpilling in its own way also. The role of height here, still smaller than behavior, right? The role of height is still smaller than the cognitive and non-cognitive traits. So that takes some points off from blackpilling, because blackpill, I think, has to be about physique, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be, but that's kind of the way that I've, you know, operationalized it in my mind going forward with this video. Since there's no relationship or dating info, I'm going to call this a 4 out of 10, but I think it's still blackpilling in its own way if you're considering things outside of a dating sphere, right? Like I'm a shorter guy, I'm not going to have as many advantages in life, and taller men will have more advantages. I can understand that mindset for shorter men, certainly, you know, and that's a real thing that we observe. And is it, you know, would you say that that's fair or something like that? Is life fair? Is nature fair? Nature doesn't care, and society probably doesn't care that much either if that's fair or not. Certainly not many people out there trying to counteract kind of height-based prejudice, right? So, you know, it's blackpilling in a way, but not related to relationships. Probably I shouldn't have even included this because it's not about relationships, but like I said, I just went down the list. This one maybe is more related to relationships, right? This is Ponchetti and colleagues 2001. It says penis length and circumference positively correlate with height. Okay, so large sample of Italians, of Italian men. And what does that mean? It means taller men, larger pee-pee, right? Is the claim true? Yes. This is what the paper says, flat out. But again, we have to ask, how strongly do they correlate? And across all of these different measurements, right? Across all of these different measurements of size, right? They have like stretched length, flaccid length, and they're correlating it with height, weight, BMI. We see some correlations. They're small. They're small, like your PP, right? They're small like the PP. So that's something that you have to consider, is that when you have a correlation that's small like this and you take individuals out of the population, you know, they could fall anywhere. There's no guarantee that you can assume like tall guy probably has a big PP, not when you have small correlations like this. Additionally, when you run a lot of comparisons like this, and we'll talk about this later, you run into what's called the multiple comparisons problem in statistics, that if you take a group of individuals and you say, okay, we're going to take this dependent variable and we're going to try to see if all of these different independent variables correlate with it, you will get statistically significant results for some of those, even if the relationship is not real. Why? You know, P, 0.05 error rate. So you run a lot of tests, you get false positives. How blackpilling is this? Well, and also reported in this paper, I didn't mention it, but it's kind of related. There's high inter-individual variation in size as well, okay? So a lot of variation between who has a small PP, who has a large PP, right? So you have that, and you have a small correlation. How blackpilling is that? Should you worry if you are like a short guy, like, oh, I have a small PP because I'm a short guy? Well, you know, on an individual level, you don't have to like guess. You know, you can pull out a tape measure and boom, and then you know. So in a practical sense, the correlation almost doesn't even matter. On an individual level, you will know the size of your own PP regardless of your height. So how blackpilling is this really? I'm going to give it a 4 out of 10 because the effect is still real. And again, it's one of those things you could look at it and say, that's kind of unfair. Big guys, bigger PP. And I'm a small guy, you might say, you know, and you might think, okay, then that, you know, unfair for me. But whatever, that's what you got there. So next paper, all right. This, like I said, I just went down the list. This paper is on women. It says physical attractiveness significantly enhances women's intra-household bargaining power. I'm not going to go into this a lot because it's kind of unrelated to what we're talking about, right? We're talking about the Blackpill, which is about men and male attractiveness and how that impacts dating. So is this effect real? Yeah, I mean, probably. You know, a more attractive woman has more bargaining power in her household, right? She's probably more valued in some ways. Is that fair for women? You know, is that kind of like a black pill for women, that, you know, more attractive women are probably more valued in the household, and so they have more bargaining power? Yeah, probably a little bit of a black pill for women. You know, certainly women as well have to deal with the same attractiveness issues. And a lot of people will dispute the magnitude of that, right? Like, oh, you can put, you know, the pig woman on Tinder and she'll get 1,000 matches, and like a normal guy won't. And so, you know, there's like a difference, but whatever. You know, for an individual woman who's very attractive and an individual woman who is not, their lives may be very different because of that, especially in a marital environment. Anyway, going on here, Huber and Fighter in 2014. We have a title here: Advanced Paternal Age is Associated with Lower Facial Attractiveness. Okay, and what we are talking about in this paper specifically is the facial attractiveness of the children of fathers who have children at a later age in life. Is it true? Do they have less attractive kids? According to the result of this paper, yes. So this is from the Wisconsin longitudinal study, if I remember correctly, which is a pretty cool database because they took a bunch of photos of young teenagers, I believe it was. I think they even have their yearbook photos in at least part of this data set. I haven't been working with it a little bit. And they track, it's a longitudinal study, so they track them over their life, and they can see things like, did youth attractiveness predict total lifetime sexual partners over like 40 years? And I've included this as well in a recent article, so go and check it out. But again, we have a paper where you can't just say, do they have more or less attractive kids? That's not informative. It doesn't tell you anything, because it doesn't tell you the size of the relationship, which is what we have up here on the slide. And the relationship between the facial attractiveness of a child and the father and mother's age at birth is only 0.07. You can see the regression lines and you can see the data points. And with the correlation that small, is it meaningful? No. That's what I'm going to say right off the bat, because if it were a little bit larger, I might hedge it and say, maybe across a population, but no, it's really small. You get correlations that look like that, and it's kind of like, okay, it's an effect that you have managed to detect in a statistically significant way because you have a data set that's like 14,000 people. And this is something else that will happen. You will detect statistically significant relationships when effects are meaningless in their size simply because you have a large data set, right? Something to consider there as well. So, how blackpilling is this? Not very. Do attractive men have kids later in life because they're so unattractive and they have to wait, and so they're having kids as a father? That's not what the authors really put forward in this paper. They said that it had probably to do with mutations that occur with age in the male reproductive system, right? In the sperm. You get older, it degrades a little bit, and that might be associated with some mutations that can result in things like lower attractiveness, but whatever. Relationship is so low, whatever. We're going to call this a 1 out of 10, so low blackpillingness. Here are some more papers, right? I'm not going to go over all these, but just to show you that I just went down the list. I'm not going through like plucking papers out. I don't think any of these are especially relevant to the discussion as far as the role of physical attractiveness in dating, right? First one is about serious suicide attempts. Second one says vegetarians are more likely to be female and have a high IQ. Okay, starting in late teens, the parental age of both sexes correlates with mutations in offspring. Maybe that one could be a little bit related. Autism risk increases past the age of 16 and 18, and subject age in population. Yes, penile length has increased by 24%. So certainly that's a study that's recent that got a lot of media attention, and probably not a black pill that on average the male penis length seems to have gotten larger in recent history, right? But whatever, they thought it was interesting, but I'm not going to analyze those because it's not really related to how black pilling is the result of the study. Pazui and colleagues. Pazui also does a lot of good research on these themes in general, another author to look up. Women view taller men as more physically attractive, more masculine, and having a greater fighting ability. Higher shoulder to hip ratios were rated as more attractive in taller men, but did not influence attractiveness ratings for shorter men. Okay. Taller men, more attractive. Yes, very consistent across the research, right? This is something everyone knows. Who doesn't know that? I think most people do. I think even, the so-called normies know this, right? People say, oh, blue pill people say attractiveness doesn't matter. You can look around the world. Walk onto the street and, turn on the TV. Who's on the TV? Tall men and tall women for that matter. Certainly height being correlated with physical attractiveness, with mating outcomes, all that. Important, right? And what do we see here? How big is the effect? Well, measured by eta squared, which is what they use to report the effect size, 0.48. So that's a large effect. If it were converted to Cohen's d, I think it would be like a 0.7 or something. So whatever, it's within the conventions that is considered a large effect. So tallness, attractiveness related, and the relationship is not small. Saying something is a large effect as far as reporting effect size conventions, Cohen's d, partial eta squared, something like that. Okay, saying something is small, medium, large. We're just saying conventions that are arbitrary, that we have invented as researchers. And I say we, but I certainly didn't do it. Someone else did it. but they are the conventions that are used, which can give you a good idea of how big a difference is if you have something to compare it with, right? A reference point. Often we don't. So we can look at what's called the practical effect size, which is using the units of measurement that were used in the study, right? The intuitive things. So a practical effect size, for example, would be a rating scale. You know, if I said rating on a scale of 1 to 10, you know, a difference of 2 points. That would be an example of a practical effect size. It would be very intuitive for you. You would have an idea, a feel for what that means. Usually attractiveness ratings in research use a scale of 1 to 7, a Likert scale, right? So what do we see here as far as a practical effect size? What does that large partial eta squared come out to? Well, between the shortest men and the tallest men, the difference in attractiveness is about 1 point. Okay, across all of their, and this shows the interaction with shoulder ratio, right, and height. So you can, you know, you don't see a large effect of shoulder to hip ratio, but you do see a little bit larger of an effect in height. You see that it goes up. Perhaps not as big as you thought, right? Certain, you know, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but maybe it's not as large as you would have expected if I say the difference between the shortest man and the tallest man is 1 point of attractiveness. Well, that's what we got here, you know. Now we can ask, how blackpilling is this? I would say this is moderately blackpilling. Why? It's a 1 point difference between the tallest and shortest man. Does that seem small to you? It could, but it's also the kind of thing that could make a big difference. And why is that? Well, as we've gone over in the other studies, as I mentioned, attractiveness functions like a gate. So in that case, if mating choices are kind of binary, like would not, then that means, you know, that 1 point could shift you into the would not category. At the same time, it's not the kind of effect where the shortest men are getting rated like in the garbage and the tallest men are getting rated like really, really high. You see that gradual increase, but it's very consistent with the black pill. Height is something in general that's very consistently associated with different mating choice outcomes. You can't change it, right? Height is pretty stable. You know, you can get the operation, whatever. But I'm going to give this an 8 out of 10. I think as far as black pilling things go, height is probably one of the more black pilling ones. Relationship, pretty consistent. Large effect size here. So this is going to be one of the more black pilling ones. 8 out of 10. Next paper, Roth and colleagues, 2023. This is called Beauty Bias: How Attractive Faces Affect Our Mate Choice in Real Life Dating. So this is actually a really cool paper. I have a bunch of slides on this that I might make into a video because I gave a presentation on this paper last month. So if you are interested in cognitive psychology and specifically the subdomain of attention, this is a really cool paper. Attention experiments in cognitive psychology can be kind of difficult to follow, so that's part of the reason I didn't just make a video on the slides. I wasn't sure if you guys would like it or if you might think it was too boring. Let me know if you want the attention attractiveness video, and maybe I'll make it for you. Anyway, I think what I'll go over here for this is the parts of this paper that relate to the dating outcomes and not the parts that relate to attention processes specifically, so that I don't bore you all out of your minds. And as far as that goes, it's a cool paper. It's a really neat paper. No one has done ever attention research that looks at speed dating stuff, right? And speed dating methodology, you get people in a room and they're rating each other and they're picking who they go on a date with, and then they combined that with attention experiments, cognitive psychology processes, using a dot probe task. So no one has ever done anything like this. It's really quite interesting. But we got to ask, is it black pilling? The portions of the paper that could be black pilling, let's look at those. So this paper actually adds to the literature that women don't really agree on what an attractive face is. And I've mentioned this in past videos. There are different takes on this. There are different perspectives, and we can look at something that was used originally in attractiveness research that's used to rate inter-rater reliability or agreement on a scale. You get a bunch of faces. You get a bunch of people to rate them. You know, so you have 100 women rating 100 faces, and then you see how much ratings agree, right? You use something like Cronbach's alpha, which used to be used more often. And you can get really high agreement. You can get a Cronbach's alpha of like 0.8 or 0.9, and you can interpret that like a correlation coefficient. And so you look at something like that and you think, wow, agreement is really, really high. People really agree on what an attractive face is. But then you use something like the ICC, right? This inter-rater correlation. And you look at the correlations between pairs of raters or between individual raters. And then you get something that's really, really low. And if you plot these faces and ratings out on a chart, and I've written about this, I've put this up in videos as well, you will see that almost every single face gets like a portion of people that find it attractive, which is not very black pilling. It's more, I guess, white pilling, right? It's kind of the opposite of black pilling. And so that's kind of what they found here as well, that there was really high variation in the faces that women found attractive, right? You have an ICC of 0.25, so that's a pretty low correlation. That means there is not agreement between women on what faces are attractive. And in a practical sense, as I mentioned, that means most of the faces are going to have a few people at the very least, you know, some portion that find them attractive. And even the most attractive faces are going to have a lot of people that say, you know, that guy, not my cup of tea. Correlations between attractiveness and real life date outcomes, right? Because speed dating study. So we're looking at who gets picked to go on an actual date. People meet in these speed dating studies. Maybe they get married. Who knows? But what's the correlation between attractiveness ratings? And we're looking at the individual ratings, right? So these are the people that are rated attractiveness by, you know, on an individual level. How well does that predict who actually gets to go on a date? And then you see a correlation of 0.44 for a first date and 0.67 for the ones that go on to a second date after the first date. So even when people say, I find this face attractive, even that doesn't predict who actually gets to go on a date or who will even make it to a second date that well. But there is a correlation, right? It does predict it. So it's not like attractiveness doesn't matter, you know. Obviously, the men that find women attractive and the women that find men attractive are going to be more likely to go on a date with the people that they personally find attractive. So it would be really weird not to see a correlation. Maybe it's weird that the correlation is not higher than it is if attractiveness is so incredibly important. You might think like everyone is going to jump at the chance to go on a date with the person that they find attractive. You know, of course, that's gated by if the other person wants to date you as well. Anyway, certainly attractiveness predicts who gets to go on the date. So, you know, how blackpilling is this? Well, is this a novel result, or does this just confirm what we already know? People are attracted to people that they find attractive, right? Almost tautological in that sense. You know, you go on dates with people that you like. Attractiveness was kind of subjective, and I say subjective, but attractiveness was kind of spread out, right? There was low agreement on who was attractive. How blackpilling is that? Knowing that most people, you know, have someone out there that will find them attractive. I'll give it a 5 out of 10. Attractiveness, still important, right? We can't say that it's the so-called blue pill, right? We can't say attractiveness didn't matter. So I'm going to give this, but at the same time, you know, it doesn't seem to be highly correlated with who actually gets these first and second dates, and it doesn't seem to be consistent across raters. So I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10. Next paper. This is Brewer and Riley, 2009. This says tall men reported greater relationship satisfaction and lower levels of cognitive or behavioral jealousy than most men. Does the paper say what the Redditors said in the title? Yeah, it's fine. So did they get it right as far as the paper is concerned? Maybe. We again see a relationship. Here you can see the line from a linear regression and a quadratic regression as well. You can see the individual points, and again, you can see this is a relationship that exists, statistically significant, but small. They did not report it, what the coefficient was, but we can look at that, you know, the slope of the line, and it looks like it's probably about 1 to 0.2. So again, a small effect, which has been pretty consistent across all of these papers, that the effects are real, but they're not as large as a lot of people within the black pill seem to think that they are. I said maybe they got it right, and why? And I mentioned this previously. You have a variable and you test it against all sorts of other variables. And you will get some that are statistically significant when they're not, just by chance. That's what happens when you when you make multiple comparisons. It's called the multiple comparison problem. And this is a paper from 2009 when people paid less attention to that kind of statistical methodology. Now, if you were to go through and say, I'm going to do 20 comparisons, right? You couldn't use a cutoff of 0.05, or at least you shouldn't. You would have to say, okay, for every comparison that I do, I have to split that in half, basically. A Bonferroni correction, in a sense. And that means, okay, you have all of these, and you're going to need p-values that are much, much smaller than 0.05 for them to truly be significant in that case. And so you have some up here, and you have one that's like 0.008, 0.007, 0.046. Would those be significant results with multiple comparisons? A lot of them wouldn't. And again, what do you see in this chart? You see at the top 5 variables that were significant that might not be if you corrected for multiple comparisons. And then you see all of these other variables that were not significant. So is this effect real? What they're reporting here, is this something that would replicate? You know, maybe, maybe not. I don't like to go through and nitpick the methodology too much, but questionable. How blackpilling is this, given that? Mildly blackpilling, right? Let's assume that the effect is real, that being tall is associated with a slightly higher level of relationship satisfaction. Okay, again, height is something you can't change. Whatever. We'll give it a 6 out of 10. Next paper here, this is Gangstad and Thornhill, right? Again, 2 big names in evolutionary psychology, very famous for doing this research. Research on the effect of ovulation on mate choices. Here we see the title from Reddit. This says, fertile women were particularly sexually attracted to arrogant, confrontational, unfaithful, muscular, tall, and physically attractive men. Female fertility did not influence the attraction to financial success, intelligence, and kindness. Okay. And the original paper was a review that covered a bunch of other different papers called Human Estrus. So, Gangstad and Thornhill. And this, was a line of research, and I say was, we'll mention that in a second, that had a lot of papers published related to it. The supposed effects of ovulation. Related to this are effects of like birth control as well on mate selection. And the idea being, of course, that women, when they're ovulating, are attracted to men who are, as this says, more muscular, the alpha, so to speak, right? And this is actually related to what became in popular manosphere culture the alpha and the beta idea. This is where it is derived from, the dual mate hypothesis, because the full title of the dual mate hypothesis is the dual mate hypothesis of ovulatory shifts, right? And the idea is that women select a man for a long-term mating and then a man for good genes. And so how is that related to ovulatory shifts? Well, women have a hidden estrus, right? You don't know visibly when a woman is fertile or not, or when she can get pregnant, what days across the month, as you do in some animals that have a visible estrus. And so the idea is that women are more attracted to that extra parenting outside of a relationship when they're fertile. So that's the whole alpha and beta idea, really. And, that's one of the things that the manosphere has gotten wrong about it. The idea that, the so-called alpha would be desirable all of the time and then the beta would not. Or even that the long-term provider is, in fact, the so-called beta, like he's less desirable. All of these, these were never a part of it and kind of get some things backward. But I've made videos on that and I've written about it at length. I won't talk about it too much here. The problem, with this research, of course, as I have written about, as I have made videos about, is that it has not replicated. This is research that has fallen to the replication crisis. Turns out most of the relationship between ovulatory shifts, between ovulation and mate choice, has not replicated. Why? Well, old research was really bad at estimating when women were actually ovulating. Samples were probably small, and what that contributes to is overinflated effect sizes when you detect an effect. And of course, just the general replication crisis across psychology and what contributes to that, bad research practices, I suppose, that a lot of what people try to replicate now does not get replicated very well. About 50% of all papers across the field of psychology, within some subfields more than others. The same author here, Gangstad, same main author, wrote an article last year reviewing all of this, reviewing the failed replications and all of that. So I'm not telling you this on my own. This is not something that I'm like making up. This is something that they have said, that the same authors of the paper have said. The whole field of evolutionary psychology has moved away from this dual mate hypothesis, from the idea that shifts in estrus, in female estrus or ovulation, contribute to different mating choices or preferences. The only thing that seems to have replicated and that seems to be consistent is that when women are fertile, or when women are ovulating, their libido is higher, right? So they are more aroused, they're going to want to have sex more, that sort of a thing, okay? And I think many women will just tell you that flat out. If you've spoken to many women about that, it's something very, very clear. You can, tell from interactions with women, like, she's ovulating. You can tell that her libido is, boom, higher. But that doesn't mean that suddenly their preferences in men change. Is that blackpilling or not? Well, the same mate preferences across the board seem to be valued. And so those are things, all of the physical attractiveness in the face and all of that, that doesn't, it doesn't change. The muscularity and all of that doesn't change. Desire for a man who provides resources, the same, doesn't change. These are all things that women want in one package. There is no preference, or there is no dual mate strategy. I'll just say it that way. There isn't a desire for the beta provider and then the alpha who is physically different. No, women want all of that in one package, and the degree to which you have those things in different measures all contribute to your attractiveness across the cycle. I've written about this as well, covered a lot of this research, right? Go to the website, why dual mating hypothesis research has failed to replicate. So how blackpilling would it be if it were true? Let's ask that, How blackpilling would it be? Well, many of the associations with the ovulation shift, right, the dual mate hypothesis, were personality variables to begin with. They weren't related to physique and physical attractiveness. You say you want a man who's more dominant or whatever the case may be. Those are behaviors. Some of them were related to muscularity. Again, something that ostensibly you can change for yourself. As I mentioned, it hasn't replicated. And women seem to desire these same traits across the cycle. If you have those traits, good for you, good news. If you don't, bad news. So how blackpilling is that? I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10. So I think for now, that is good as far as the papers we're going to look at. Otherwise, the video will just go on forever. Final thoughts on this, on the scientific black pill in general, and the papers and the subreddit, and what have we actually seen across this? Well, as I said at the beginning, I think the black pill is usually supposed to be about physical attractiveness, right? And within physical attractiveness, again, the idea that it is primarily facial attractiveness. Across these papers, we actually see a lot that's about personality. So to some extent, there is a narrative in the black pill that is blackpilling in a way unrelated to physical attractiveness, where men say like, oh, women don't want a nice guy, women are attracted to dark triad man. Okay, well, maybe that's blackpilling, but it's certainly not the physical attractiveness narrative. There's a question about personality, and that is, to what extent can you change it? Well, consistent across personality psychology is the fact that personality remains very, very stable over the lifetime. That doesn't mean that individuals can't shift their personality at all. At the same time, if you are motivated to do that, if you want to do that, if you're going to be able to stick with whatever you need to stick with to change your personality, those are also personality variables. So it's kind of like a chicken and egg thing, even a free will question. And certainly that's something that me and Thinking Ape have discussed on his channel. The extent to which You can change your personality, even assuming that it was malleable. What personality traits do you have ahead of that that might make you give up, right? Before you even can follow through with that. And certainly a lot of what we have seen as well is related to physique, to the body, and to muscularity. And that's something you can change. And we can also ask something about that as well that intersects with personality. And that's, to what extent do individual differences in personality mean that some people can change their body by working out and getting jacked and lifting more than others? Because, you know, within fitness YouTube spaces, everyone is treated as if they're a blank slate, you know. For some reason, people seem to think that evolution stopped here and there are no differences up here, and that everyone is going to have the same amount of discipline or will or motivation, the ability to stick with an exercise program and all of that, but it's not, you know. And up here, people aren't as in control as they think they are. So physically, can you change your physique if you go through all of the steps? Yes, right? You can make big changes to your physique if you eat right and you go to the gym every day and, you know, train and all of that, and you do it for a long time. You're going to have a body that's better than most men. Can you behaviorally stick with that? That's a personality question, and there are individual differences where some people are going to do it and some people aren't. Some people are going to make it. Some people are not, contrary to what Ziz would have said, that we're all going to make it, bro. Some people aren't going to make it. I'll just tell you that right now. Blackpilling on a personality level, perhaps. I don't want to undermine anyone's motivation. You know, you won't make it if you don't try, certainly. And if you want to make it, then you must try. Simple as that goes. If you want to give up, well, that's on you. I'm not a motivation guy here to motivate you. I'm just laying it out the way that it is. What else do we see across at least these papers that I just went down the list and looked at? Very small effect sizes, right? For height, well, height had a large effect size in that one paper, at least, not for the relationship satisfaction paper. But generally, what do we see across all of these variables? Small effect sizes, and that's very consistent with psychology in general and very consistent with research on physical attractiveness, facial attractiveness. Typically, you see small effect sizes, right? This is inconsistent with the black pill in the sense that, you know, the belief that physical attractiveness is what matters more than anything and that it matters a lot. That doesn't seem to be super consistent, at least when you get to moderate levels of attractiveness, right? Which is something else to consider that we saw in one of the earlier papers, that the looks test, the gate, the bar you must leap over, it's kind of low. Yeah, I don't want to say it's like low, but it's average man low, right? So you don't have to be Chad to get a wife or a girlfriend, to have a happy relationship or whatever. That should be obvious by looking at the world around you, the fact that most men go on to be fathers, the fact that most men are in relationships, the fact that, you know, something like 4% of men remain virgins past age 25. All of these things, you know, most people are going to make it in a sense, okay? So a little bit of a white pill in that sense. We see small effect sizes with attractiveness. Probably what the black pill gets wrong on that is exaggeration of the effect, that even when compared to other variables, physical attractiveness is very, very important. You go through the papers, you look at the actual effects, and it's like, kind of small. But at the same time, physical attractiveness still matters, and it still often emerges as a variable that is more important than other variables. So, I've said in the past, that is kind of a core nucleus of truth within the black pill, right? That it matters, that physical attractiveness is important, and how much can you change that? You know, certainly there's the saying within the black pill, there's no gym for your face. Difficult to change your face without cosmetic surgery, and even then, maybe it doesn't go that well. So that certainly can be blackpilling. The fact of nature that all individuals are not born equally, at least on a physical sense. Some people are taller. Some people look ways that are more attractive to most women, and all of that. You can interpret the research across all of the research in different ways. If you, I guess, immerse yourself in a scientific black pill community in the subreddit, and you read these papers, all of the time, every day, you will get a consistent picture. And that is that attractiveness is important. If they're not telling you the effect sizes, if they're not comparing attractiveness with other variables that are not physical attractiveness, you will get a picture that is probably exaggerating the effect of physical attractiveness to some extent, right? If you come to the conclusion that personality does not matter at all from those, I mean, what can be said, you would be wrong. It does. You could make a subreddit, called Scientific White Pill and just fill it. You could just fill it every single day with papers that relate different personality traits to relationship outcomes, to sexual behavior, and all of that. You have personality traits in psychology that are, constructs that are basically measures of your willingness to have sex with many partners, with having sex with many partners. You wouldn't be able to say things like, oh, the dark triad predicts more sexual partners if personality didn't matter. So that's something to take into consideration. And if you want to understand everything that goes into dating outcomes, mating outcomes, relationships, marriages, sex, having a lot of partners, and all of that, you got to look across all of the literature. It probably doesn't serve you very well to immerse yourself in a community that says, we're going to focus only on this thing, and we're only going to post papers that support this thing. It's called cherry picking, right? You're picking the ones out that conform to that ideology and ignoring a lot. And it's not like these are conflicting ideas or facts about human nature that you have to believe in one or the other. You can believe that attractiveness is very important. The research can show that, and that doesn't nullify that behavior is important. People seem to think that these are incompatible in some way, but in fact they're very complementary. Certainly research on the halo effect shows how complementary they are, that behaviors influence perceptions of attractiveness, and attractiveness influences perceptions of behavior and personality, even on a neurological level in the brain. So, all things to consider. I hope you guys liked this review. I think we learned some things. And follow me on Twitter, guys, DatePsych. Follow the website, datepsychology.com. Like the channel, subscribe. I'll make another video for you guys very soon.